When we go through our lives, we're always assuming we're the logical ones. If someone disagrees with us, they either don't have the facts or they're just erring in their logic or their thinking in some way. But I think assuming we're the ones thinking logically is an error, because I think we actually base our thinking on something else. Stories. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. Now, before I begin, I'd just like to clarify one thing. Though I think stories are at the core of our thinking, I still think we can arrive at truth. Now, that may seem counterintuitive to you, because if we wanted to arrive at truth, we would assume that logic is at the core of our thinking, or should be at the core of our thinking. But I think after I go through why I think story is at that core instead of logic, you'll actually understand why I think we can get to the truth even though we start from stories. So I used to think it was the case that people's thinking generally followed a logical pattern. And I still believe people's thinking generally follows a logical pattern because people pick up a sense of what logic is within the world. They don't have a perfect logical sense. They don't know informal or formal logic. They're not going to be able to name many fallacies for you. They're not going to be able to point out fallacies or errors in thinking. And I think that's an issue when we try to move toward the truth. But I think people generally have a sense of what is logical or what isn't logical. People understand things go in a sequence. There is research that supports the idea that children understand causality at a very young age. Now, I think assuming we have a fuzzy logic at the core of our thinking makes sense. People try to rationalize or they try to justify what they are doing based on the information they have. So even though a person didn't have perfect logic in their life, they tried to at least make their life make sense. And if you ever run into a person who is unable to make their life make sense in some way or take their ideas that they have and then bring them together with their experiences, if there's any incongruence, it can really affect a person in a lot of emotional ways. It can put a lot of stress on that person. So that's how I thought. I thought that people generally just had a logical core, even though that was a very faulty logic. As I've continued to think about it, I think that underlying a logical core is a core of storytelling. Now, I don't just say this because I write stories. I've just been trying to think how people arrive at the conclusions they do, especially why people take on ideas that are completely different than another person. Why can we have two people looking at the exact same thing and saying two completely different things while looking at that? Now, I've talked about the idea of paradigms in the past. And for those of you who can't remember, paradigms are essentially a foundation that you use to build your ideas from. Another way to think about this is glasses you put on to see the world. If I put on green glasses with green tinted glass, everything is going to have a green tint to it. It's going to be monochrome. If I put on red tinted glasses, everything is going to be tinted in a red way. And everybody has a paradigm they're working from. And people try to justify their paradigms if they're even aware that they have paradigms. But underlying even the paradigm, I believe that people tell themselves stories about the world. In some cases, they pick up these stories from people they know, such as their parents or their relatives or teachers or their siblings, etc. In some cases, I think people look at the world around them and they make determinations about what that world is. They take in certain information and they create a paradigm from that information. But a person who is able to look at the world outside of themselves and determine certain things about that world and say, hey, this is how I'm going to look at the world, is still using information that is embedded within the idea of a story. Why should I look at the world logically? If I determine that logic isn't a good thing, then I still have to determine why I think it's a good thing. It's an infinite regress if you want to think about it like that. If I say something is not good because some people have said logic is not a good thing, then they are actually making a value judgment about logic itself. And people who say that logic is a good thing also make a value judgment. But where does this idea that logic is a good thing comes from? Well, the people on the logical side of the equation might say, well, we want to be able to look at the world objectively. And what we are doing when we look at the world logically is we are trying to see the world as it works. We are trying to see the world as clearly as possible. But even within this, there is a value judgment. Do we really need to see the world as clearly as possible? Is it a good thing to see the world as clearly as possible? Now, I think that most people would say, yes, it's very good to see what the truth of a matter is, and they would support that using logic, but we're right back where we started. At the beginning of thinking is a value judgment, that one type of thinking is better than another. I believe logic is a very good thing. I believe we should try to be as logical as possible. I don't think we should try to be like Vulcans and be completely logical because we aren't just logical beings. Therefore, we shouldn't just respond to things logically. But I think logic should make up a large component of how we live our lives and how we determine where we go. But one of the biggest reasons of why I say that a story is at the core of our thinking rather than logic is because we have to tell ourselves a story about what is good and what is not. You might be thinking, well, this is just an idea of what is good and what is not. But I think it goes beyond that, right? What we do in our minds is we say, oh, we've got this specific thing we're dealing with. And we tell ourselves a story about if we do this specific thing, it's going to end up in this specific place. It's not a fully fleshed out story as we usually understand it, but it takes us from one point and it brings us through a process to the other. It doesn't matter if we're correct about that story. It doesn't matter if we've actually made the assumptions correctly. The process of telling the story to ourselves is what gets us to that end result, is what gets us to the point where we think, okay, I want to go in this direction or in the opposite direction. If you want to lose weight, you're telling yourself a story about, oh, I want to lose weight so I can be healthier and my life is going to be better. And it's projecting into the future. You losing weight hasn't happened yet. You are extending your thinking beyond your present situation to determine what is happening in the future. Now, you may be thinking, well, we're still using logic on some level because we're going through a sequence of events and seeing how they tie together to get to the end result. And I would say yes. We are doing that. This is why I said in the past that I believe we have a fuzzy type of logic we think with. But I say storytelling is at the core of our thinking because though it relies on logic and a sequence of events that make sense together, storytelling is a tweaked type of logic. It takes up logic because it absolutely has to use it, but how we think through our process, how we get to our end results, how we get to the thoughts we want to hold on to is more like storytelling than strict logic. And again, as I said before, this happens on multiple different levels. It can happen with our basic assumptions. We think some things are good and some things are bad. Some of these assumptions have come from just natural ideas. If we look around the world, we see that certain things are evident to us, and many good things are passed on through our culture. This also happens within our daily lives. When you look at how humans work, you can see that there is a logical side of things and an emotional side of things. And what is usually the case is that we respond to things emotionally. And I think this is what is part of the storytelling. Storytelling is a naturally emotional thing. It's meant to evoke feelings. It's meant to sweep us up into an experience. It's meant to mimic life. And when we approach something in life, we don't see it through a logical lens. We see it through that storytelling lens. We see it through that emotional lens. And once we understand it through that emotional, or what I like to call storytelling lens, then we justify what we see with logic. So it doesn't happen often the other way around. And we actually have to teach ourselves to think logically first and then bring our emotions alongside that logic. But it is an error if we assume we are thinking logically first all the time. We need to be aware of the issues we can have with our thinking so that we can actually be humble about our own thinking. We can look at ideas and we can assess whether those ideas are good and give different ideas their due. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.